So basically, as far as I can read it, you guys can let me know if you disagree or if I've got it wrong, but basically transfer fees and wages have to add up to less than 70% of a club revenue. Now, for a club like Bayern Munich and Dortmund, that's absolutely fine because, Bayern Munich make an absolute fortune. Dortmund also make an absolute fortune, it's worth noting. I think they're in the top 10 for revenue, if I'm not mistaken, but Bayern Munich are only seventh in Europe for their wage bill. Dortmund only 14th for their wage bill. And according to UEFA, which I have the numbers in front of me here, Bayern's wage bill is only 52% of their revenue and Dortmund's is only 50% of their revenue. So both of those clubs are absolutely fine. And as I mentioned a moment ago, the league average is about 40%. However, one thing I did notice in this report is that it has the numbers for Leipzig and Leverkusen because they both feature in the top 20 clubs for revenue in Europe. And this is potentially somewhere where things might get a little ugly because Leverkusen's wage bill was 63% of their revenue. These are from 2024, 2025. But Leipzig's is 72%. And now that's just the wage bill. That's not including transfer fees as well. And of course, transfer fees is a wee bit tricky because obviously most of these clubs make a transfer profit in the in the transfer market. So I guess they can maybe offset these things ever so slightly. But those Leipzig numbers really stood out to me. 72% is a huge outlier for a Bundesliga club, I would say. And it'll be interesting to see if, well, I'm trying to think how the best way to describe this. It'd be interesting to see if that's a figure that is well known within circles of German football, and it's something that a lot of clubs in German football might look to point out and maybe, I don't want to say trip up Leipzig, but it's worth noting that, and I was saying this to you guys before we came on air, that the Kicker article on this announcement, and I think they spoke to a few members of the supervisory board at the DFL, which I guess is now the Bundesliga supervisory board, I don't know. But they spoke to the HSV CFO, Dr. Eric Hoover, and he made the point, we must now consistently continue down this path we have taken, i.e., German football becoming more profitable, more sustainable. And then he says, especially with regards to the regulation of multi-club ownership. So he's basically just thrown in there, this is great news. We're going to be profitable. Everyone's going to be careful with their money. Oh, and by the way, we're also coming from multi-club groups, which of course Leipzig are part of. And potentially Leipzig are the outliers with regards to clubs that are keeping an eye on their finances here. But I think this is something, Manny, that you maybe know a bit more about, because I think, if I'm not mistaken, you spoke to Leipzig, and especially with their wage bill this season.
Well, I think that in regards to the club's revenue, the wage bill went up because they no longer had the Champions League money coming in. And that threw them a curveball in terms of revenue, and something that will missing out in the Champions League was described to me as something that will hit the budget for 4 or 5 years, which is of course significant, right? If any club in European football that relies on Champions League income at the moment, and there's a lot of them. The big news, of course, was that Sebastian Kehl said we had already calculated the money from beating Atalanta and advancing to the next round, right? Which is crazy for me, but this is a reality for a lot of teams, not just Leipzig, that they're calculating money that they not necessarily always have. So I can see the salary in going up in terms to where it is in regards to revenue significantly if a team misses out on Champions League football. I think the other thing is that, and Matt, you can jump in here and add to this as well, that although RB Leipzig is sponsored by Red Bull and owned by Red Bull, to call it the cattle black, that's how it works. They get a significant amount of the revenue from the ownership group. But the problem with Leipzig is, and a lot of East Germany, is that it is a structurally weaker part of Germany in terms of commercial revenue that exists even in a rich city by East German standards like Leipzig. They don't have the same revenue basis than a club in Frankfurt would have, or a club in Hamburg, or a club in Munich, because there isn't quite as many commercial partners that they can tap into DHL obviously uses the airport there. There's an Audi company, but Audi's already but Audi's already invested in another club, Bayern Munich, right? So they don't quite have the same opportunities to tap into commercial deals as like other teams in the Bundesliga would have. And so, yeah, I think it is something that they definitely will keep an eye on. I think the same is true for Bayer Leverkusen. I think if they would miss out on Champions League football next season, which is quite possible, that figure that you quoted to us, the 63%, will probably go over 70%, right? Because that revenue that they would miss out on Champions League football vis-a-vis to what it is compared in the Europa League is such a huge drop. And I think that would constitute a problem for quite a few teams. I mean, we talked about what would happen if Borussia Dortmund had missed out on Champions League football, or where would they stand in terms of what they pay in salaries compared to the revenue if there wasn't the Club World Cup. This is also true for Bayern Munich, right? And I think these are always kind of the problems that I think teams calculate with money that they are not guaranteed to earn. And I think Leipzig is a very good example for that. Matt, if you want to jump in.
Yeah, I think you've both hit on really good points in terms of the Bundesliga teams that this is likely to affect more than others, and also the rather unique situation of both RB Leipzig and Bayer Leverkusen. It's interesting that this comes at the time when, of course, we're still waiting for the outcome of the investigations into the 50+1 rule by Germany's competition authorities, and as I've reported several times, the latest state of play is that the ball has been basically put over into the court of the DFL, or as we're calling it now, the Bundesliga, and of the clubs, to ensure uniformity in this question of 50+1, basically saying that if you want to have this competition restricting regulation 50+1, we're fine with it, but you have to apply it uniformly across the league. And of course, that is without naming names, aimed at the exemptions 50+1, so it's Bayer Leverkusen, VfL Wolfsburg, to an extent Hoffenheim, although as we've said, they don't strictly speaking, they're back to being a 50+1 club now. Though, as I've reported, the influence of Hop is still very much present, and of course, RB Leipzig are not an exemption for 50+1. They've circumvented it, and that's what makes it interesting in terms of the squad costs that they're able to, that they're able to afford, and where that money comes from. In recent years, and it has, for purely practical reasons, it has been an aim of Red Bull and of RB Leipzig to make themselves more organic and more sustainable, using revenue streams which are not just directly from Red Bull, to whom RB Leipzig as a club are still heavily indebted, although that debt was reduced recently when they merely converted it into equity, which is something nobody else can do in the league.
No.
So go
That's
on,
not 100% true. This has also been done by other teams in Germany. One that might wear blue and white in place of Munich.
Okay, yes. Fair enough. But yeah, okay. Also a situation whereby,
but it is other examples as well. Other teams have used this mechanism to get off the debt.
It can be done, but then again, not been done in situations where that the entity converting the equity is a 100% or 99.999% owner. So there is that unique situation, and of course, like you said, if RB Leipzig were to then drop out of European competition for several years, and they're missing out on that extra revenue, then those gaps have to be plugged directly by Red Bull in various ways that they can do that. Obviously, still adhering to various DFL and or Bundesliga and UEFA regulations. But the fact they can do that at all that's basically the very, very root of where the accusations of, to put it simply, distorting the competition come from. So it's interesting that these movements come particularly, right at this moment. Leverkusen, similar situation there as well. I've made the comparison before earlier this season that hardly any other club in the league could have afforded to make the Ten Hag mistake that Bayer Leverkusen made. It's all right saying, well done, you recognised your mistake, get rid of him after 3 games, pay off the contract. If anybody else had made that decision, they would have been stuck with him until at least Christmas, or they would have had to persevere because you couldn't just pay off the contract, whereas Leverkusen could because they're backed by a pharmaceutical company. So it's interesting that these rules, these attempts to regulate are coming in at the same time that we are expecting at some point, undefined in the future, the Bundesliga to respond to the demands of the competition authorities and give us a future path for 50+1. Yeah, also interesting that we saw the comments from Eric Hoover from HSV that Stefan was mentioning. On the weekend that there were more anti-Red Bull protests at Hamburg during that game. So that topic's not gone away. Probably one topic that HSV and St. Pauli agree on, and there's not many of them.
But the multiple club ownership thing is interesting too, because we have to put Bayern Munich in that pot now too.
Yeah, we're going to get onto that. That's a good point. Yeah,
right, because they together with Los Angeles FC have created a multiple club ownership structure.
Bayern, how does that work though, Manu? For people who don't really understand it, like, do Bayern own that club, or how does it work?
So together with Los Angeles FC, they created a company called Red and Gold, and Red and Gold has bought several teams around the world, either through minority or majority stakes that both Bayern Munich and LAFC control together.
So they've basically put money in a pot together and gone out and started buying up football clubs.
Pretty much. That is
right. Okay.
That is, in lay terms, as easily as explained as you can. That's exactly what they've done. They've created a company that is buying football clubs that they can both use to dip in for player development. And it is a multiple club ownership model. I mean, that's what it is.
And it's one that would also benefit Bayern from a youth development point of view. I mean, it's definitely quite interesting because you look at the way that football's going in terms of financing, and as you said, I touched on it in my newsletter this week in terms of the prevalence of private equity in football, and it is. I mean, I think the number is about 40% of clubs around Europe's top leagues are owned or partially owned by private equity. Some of those private equity firms are part of multi-club ownership models. Daniel Fark, who, German manager, works for one in Leeds that also partly own Rangers, which are down the road from where I live in Scotland. And they're both owned by, they're both owned by an NFL club, I guess, technically, but there's also private equity involved in that as well.
And Leeds are sponsored by Red Bull.
Yeah. Oh, and Red Bull actually have a stake in Leeds, if I'm not mistaken.
Is there a stake as well? Is it more than just sponsorship?
Yeah.
I don't quote me on that, but I'm almost certain there's a stake in there in Leeds as well. So that's a funny.
That's how they cleaned up the Kevin Augustine transfer mess.
Oh yeah, God, remember that.
But that's interesting. These are precisely the sort of issues that Eric Hoover there from HSV is indirectly referring to. Basically, these are precisely the sort of intertwinements that I suppose they don't want to be seen because they suspect it enables various circumventions of regulations.
Yeah, exactly. So
and I think that's a fair point.
Yeah, I know, absolutely. And I mean, I guess the point I was going to make there was that you can see that the Bundesliga has made a political decision to not get into bed with private equity, and obviously the high. What's what I'm looking for? The obvious example was the CVC deal, which was pushed away at the last minute, but it's not as if, I mean, obviously 50+1 is a huge part of that. It's a huge barrier to private equity getting into these firms, but there's also a kind of cultural decision that these clubs, obviously through the support or through demand from supporters, that private equity doesn't get involved in. Now, There are some. I mentioned my newsletter. There's obviously Leipzig have this to an extent, but also, Augsburg have that kind of deal with. I'm not quite sure the makeup of that one, but they obviously have a deal with some sort of private equity in the US. But for the most part, it's very hard for kind of private equity to kind of, lay the foundations in German football.
I think Augsburg is worse because it's like far less transparent what's going on there.
Yeah, for sure. So, but I guess the point I'm making is that German football is obviously deciding it's going to go in a different route, and it's not going to embrace private equity either at a league level through selling broadcasting rights or commercial rights, or through encouraging clubs to kind of, welcome these kind of minority stakes from private equity. And I think the statement from today really does give an impression that they're like, right, we don't take private equity. We are going to be quite stringent with our financial regulations, because the thing is, we talked about this before we started recording. In terms of how that actually plays out in terms of clubs, it's not a huge difference to what the rules are now, unless, of course, it does start tripping up clubs like Leverkusen and Leipzig, who have to kind of bend over backwards to kind of explain their finances, maybe. And then, of course, if the next step after that is to then say, right, we don't want multi-club partnerships in German football, then obviously that would have huge ramifications, not just on Leipzig, but also on Bayern Munich as well. So, be an interesting one to keep an eye on for sure.